Welcome to IRA episode 116, the Tripartite Tomfoolery of Utah and the United States and the clown world that we live in. I am your host, Coel, of Investigations of Ritual Abuse, Fringe Concerns, Anti-Tribe, Government Sex Predators, and Church Sex Predators, as well as Investigations in Ritual Abuse. The current live stream that you're listening to or watching, depending on your preference. Today we're going to examine the clown world that we are currently embroiled in. For those of us in the land of the sane and the living, we increasingly find ourselves trapped in a future that doesn't work. And what I mean by that is, in the state of Utah, we have a tripartite tomfoolery going on that simply doesn't make any damn sense whatsoever. To wit, all of these Latter-day Saints who confess to their bishops that they sexually abused or raped children or abused their families, their spouses, so on and so forth, those guys, they don't receive a letter from the church security office banning them from church properties. But somebody like Jason Preston, who reports on that sexual abuse and the church's efforts to cover it up and contain it, he's banned from church property for a year. He's required to undergo possible psychiatric counseling and medication upon his return in a year's time, as conditioned by the church. This is the reality of it. And theoretically, Mr. Preston of We Are the People Utah, who has had me on for, I believe, 5 podcast episodes, he is banned from church-owned property in its entirety, which means that he can't go to downtown Salt Lake because guess what? Church owns a lot of real estate in downtown Salt Lake. And theoretically, if he violates the church's order in that respect, he could be trespassed. That's the fucking world we live in. Like, straight up. Somebody who rapes and molests kids, they don't get banned from boards. They don't get banned from their meeting house or their stake center or any other church property. As long as they go to LDS Social Services for counseling for a year. If they are excommunicated, most of them aren't, they could get rebaptized in a year's time upon a satisfactory bill of health from LDS Social Services, which we know is a rubber stamp for the church in that respect. And through the magical priesthood power, these people are declared cured of their pedophilia and their rapist instincts and so on and so forth, and they're returned to full membership and full privileges. Their victims get a life sentence, but they do not. They might have to go through a year of counseling or a little bit of trouble with their bishop and stake president, but they aren't banned from church property. But someone who reports on the endemic sexual abuse that's present within the church and within the state of Utah, like Jason Preston and Alexia Preston, Justin Riggs was excommunicated because he started reporting on this. Justin Riggs of LDS Abuse, you can find him on Twitter. Jason and Alexia Preston have been banned from church-owned properties, including their meeting house where their ward meets for church. But if you rape a fucking kid, you're not banned from church property. You don't receive a letter from the church security offices informing you that you're banned for any period of time from meeting houses and stake centers and bishop storehouses and any other form of church-owned property. You don't receive that kind of a letter. You can fuck a kid, but if you report on child fuckers, then guess what? You get banned. So the first example of this tomfoolery that I'm going to put up on the screen, which is someone that we've reported on before, is Judge Catherine Conklin. She presided over the legal proceedings of Officer Colton Johansson. He's a former school resource officer, former Ogden police officer who was busted because he was undergoing a polygraph for a lateral position as a police officer. He was applying for a position. He had to undergo a polygraph examination, and he wasn't doing too well on that polygraph examination. So the examiner stopped the polygraph and asked Colton Johansson why he was doing so miserably. And Colton Johansson disclosed that in 1994, as a 24-year-old, he had sexually abused an infant. He raped an infant. And he also disclosed that he had boxes of child sexual abuse material in his garage at home. Now, he later contested, that he was pleasuring himself to that material. He said that he pilfered through it to find the adult pornography so that he could jerk off to that. That's the level. Judge Catherine Conklin, despite Johansson's admission that he had sexually abused an infant, found him not to be a threat to the community, gave him 30 days in jail for raping a fucking kid, an infant, in 1994, and for storing child porn that he was able to procure as part of his work on a sex crimes task force. Now, that's all evidence, that child sexual abuse material and everything else in that little collection. That's evidence in criminal proceedings. He broke the chain of custody by having it in his private residence, endangering God knows how many convictions in the process. But he's not a threat to the community. His ex-boss, the former Ogden police chief, apparently testified on his behalf, which should give you every indication that you need as to what the status of the Ogden Police Department was under his leadership. Not a danger to the community. Not a threat to the community. Fucks infants. Waits 30 plus years to disclose what he did because he's flunking a polygraph at the middle of a job interview to move laterally. He's a school resource officer at the time. High school. So, apparently he wasn't attracted to those kids. They were too old. But he's not a threat to the community, according to Catherine Conklin, a judge in Utah. That's the kind of discretion and discernment we have in our judiciary. And if you think that Catherine Conklin is alone in this, I got news for you. She isn't. Because there are others in the judiciary who have exemplified the same kind of wonderful discretion. And up on the screen you see Thomas Lowe. He's a judge. And at a sentencing hearing for Keith Robert Vallejo, who sexually abused 2 women in his family, he was a bishop of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He used his position as a bishop to rape and sexually abuse 2 women. Judge Thomas Lowe at his sentencing hearing, see, this is after Vallejo has been found guilty. He's been tried and found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. He did this. He did what he was accused of. He sexually assaulted 2 women. Judge Thomas Lowe describes him as an extraordinarily good man. A great man, even. An extraordinarily good man, according to Judge Thomas Lowe, do bad things. Sometimes. This is the kind of clown world we live in. You're sentencing a convicted rapist. You're sentencing someone who had at least 2 victims that we know of. He was convicted of sexually abusing 2 victims. And your instinct in that moment, with the victims present in the courtroom, with their families present in the courtroom, is to describe their assailant as a tragically good man. You can't make this shit up. You just simply cannot make this shit up. Some of you have a bigger problem with the language I'm using in this podcast than you do with what I'm describing here, and that's kind of the fucking problem, isn't it? So, Judge Thomas Lowe describes Keith Robert Vallejo in front of his victims at a sentencing hearing as an extraordinarily good man who did a bad thing. This is a bishop in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Presumably, according to the teachings of the church, those who called Keith Robert Vallejo to that position are imbued and endowed with a special spiritual discernment that enables them to call only qualified men and women to positions of authority within the church. They have that spiritual discernment by the priesthood power. They're gifted with that discernment as the Lord's anointed to make sure that the Lord's church, the restored church, the only true church according to the endowment, is in fact run by people who are qualified, people who are going to shepherd the flock. Well, I guess in the case of Keith Robert Vallejo, they failed miserably. Because Keith Robert Vallejo was sexually abusing people that he was in a position of authority over, a position of ecclesiastical authority. But don't worry, he's an extraordinarily good man who did a bad thing. That's what his victims had to hear at his sentencing hearing. Because Judge Thomas Lowe called him an extraordinarily good man who did a bad thing. Lest you think that these are two isolated incidents, I want to assure you that they're not, because up on the screen, as you're about to see, is Judge Don Torgerson. Judge Don Torgerson presided over the trial of a young man named Aiden Hoffman. Now, Aiden Hoffman was 22 years old. He was facing 2 criminal cases in his home state of Maine and, of course, in Utah, because he had hundreds of files of child sexual abuse material across multiple jurisdictions. And he was 22 years old. And Judge John Torgerson, at his sentencing, said that 112 days is a lot of time in jail for a man of Aiden Hoffman's privileges. He had a privileged life. Those of us who don't have privileged lives, you don't have to worry about being soft on crime or having a lesser sentence because, you're used to that shit. So you need a harder sentence because your privilege level is not as high. And therefore, your criminal sentence should be more punitive. 112 days is a lot of time in jail for someone like Aiden Hoffman. That was what Judge Don Torgerson said. Now, Aiden Hoffman possessed hundreds of files of child sexual abuse material. And like every other pedophile, he is creating a demand for a supply. And the production of child sexual abuse material involves the rape and torture of children by adults. So when you have that kind of material, when that kind of material gratifies your prurient interest and you go out and you seek to procure it, you are creating a demand for the supply, and the supply and manufacture of that type of material involves the sexual abuse of children. Now, it is my position and IRA's position, since I run IRA and I'm the owner and chief author over at IRA. It is IRA's position that those who possess child sexual abuse material should be charged as accomplices after the fact in the sexual assault of the children who are depicted in that material. Not just depicted, they're recorded in that material. So fuck Don Torgerson. The district court, the Utah State Courts, issued a defense of Judge Torgerson in the aftermath of the outrage over his sentencing. He was up for censure. There are people who are agitating for his removal from office. So the Utah State Courts felt compelled to defend him by pointing out that this was part of a plea agreement. That light sentence was part of a plea agreement negotiated by the prosecutors and recommended by adult probation and parole. So Judge Don Torgerson was simply deferring to the prosecution and adult probation and parole in highlighting Aiden Hoffman's privilege level as a reason to say that 112 days in jail for possessing, I believe, if I recall correctly, over 600 child sexual abuse material files, that's a lot of time for someone of Aiden Hoffman's privilege. I think he's learned his lesson. 112 days. 112 days for creating demand for child rape, child sexual abuse. That's what he got. That's what the fucking state of Utah is. So, when we review all of these judges who refer to convicted rapists as extraordinarily good men, who say that someone who raped an infant in 1994 is not a threat to the community, when we say all of that, we say to ourselves, hey, it's not that big of a fucking deal. The state of Utah. Not that big of a deal at all. This is the clown world that we live in, and I don't think it reflects the will of the majority in Utah. I think that Utah's government and Utah's judiciary and Utah's prosecutors are anti-democratic. They're anti-victim, and therefore they have constructed Utah as a sanctuary state for pedophiles and child rapists and sexual abusers. That's what I think. After 4 years of working on this topic, and largely in a Utah-specific context, that's what I think. I think Utah is a sanctuary state for pedophiles and child predators. I don't think it's an accident. I think the people that we've highlighted in this podcast thus far have played a huge role in making Utah a sanctuary state for child predators, for sexual predators in general. But lest you think that this is isolated to just, a few rogue judges and everything, I want to highlight the legislators who are part of this as well. This is Representative Todd Wheeler of the Utah State House. He's a representative from Woods Cross, and I want to make sure that he's actually a Utah State Senator from Woods Cross, Utah, and he introduced legislation that would lessen time on the sex offender registry for certain sexual offenses, including trafficking, if I recall correctly. He said that it shouldn't be a life sentence, and that a lifetime on the sex offender registry was, in effect, a lifetime sentence for certain types of sex offenses, certain types of sex crimes. What do you think the fucking victims have, Todd? What do you think they have? You think they have a life sentence? You think this isn't going to affect every single relationship they ever have going forward? At the very least, the people who abused them, the people who molested them, the people who violated them in the most egregious way imaginable, those people should face a lifetime on a sex offender registry, if only because it will at least provide some advance notice to their neighbors and everyone else in the state in which they live that they are a danger to the community. And make no mistake, these people who sexually assault others, they don't stop until they die. There's no such thing as a one-off. They don't rehabilitate. They don't recover. They don't overcome their pedophilia and their sexually predatory urges and behavior. They keep going until they die. And only a third of their victims are going to report. And if they are in that third, they are in the 330 out of 1,000 or so who report. Basically, 54 of them are going to be prosecuted, and 28 are going to be convicted, and 25 are going to go to prison. And of course, of that 25 who actually face some form of incarceration, a lot of them are going to be like Aiden Hoffman. They're going to be men and women of privilege who do 112 days for possessing 600 or so files of child sexual abuse material, or 30 days if they're a school resource officer like Colton Johansson, who raped an infant 30 years ago. They're not a danger to the community, so they'll get 30 days, they'll get 112 days, and they'll just be on their merry little fucking way. And Colton Johansson will be whining, like most of them, about how persecuted he is because he's asked to leave certain places when he goes out. Well, you fucked a baby. You should be shunned. You should be a fucking pariah. What the hell what are we doing here? I mean, in the aftermath of the Epstein files, and I say aftermath because there's not going to be any other release. The acting Attorney General, Todd Blanche, has made that perfectly clear. Imagine how bad the remaining files that haven't been released have to be for the files that they did release to be the ones they said, oh, well, that's what the public can handle. That's what we can release and still be safe. Imagine how atrocious the files they haven't released have to be for them to say that the files that they did release, which contain allegations of cannibalism or recollections of cannibalism. I can't even believe I'm having this fucking discussion, but imagine how bad the files they haven't released have to be, given how awful the files they did release were. There was one image, and it was blacked out, but it was very clear that this is a very small child, probably between 5 and 8 years of age. And she is clearly giving head to an older man because his torso is visible. Of course, his genitals are blacked out. Her face is blacked out. But it's very clear from what's remaining in the photo, he's not wearing any pants. And she's leaning forward, and he's making a child perform oral sex on him. Like, that's one of the fucking images that they did release. And there's nobody to be prosecuted, according to Todd Blanche. We're not going to prosecute anybody in this. Maybe maybe the man in that picture is one of the 24 or so men that Ghislaine Maxwell alleges received non-prosecute agreements by the Department of Justice. We don't know who those men are, and the Department of Justice is in no hurry to let us know what exactly they received a non-prosecute agreement for. But, hey, this is the clown world in which we live. You can have a photograph of yourself forcing a child to give you oral sex. It's released to the public, albeit blacked out to some degree, but it's very clear from the rest of the photo that isn't blacked out what you're doing, and guess what? You're not going to be prosecuted. You're not going to, like, there's photographic evidence of the crime that you committed, and it is a crime, but you're not going to be prosecuted. There's all sorts of evidence of crimes in the files that they did release. With the Department of Justice, first, Pam Bondi. Second, Todd Blanche has said they're not going to prosecute anybody else other than Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. People, what more do you fucking need to be out in the street demanding that heads roll? I mean, it's bad enough, but Todd Wheeler looks like amateur hour for saying you shouldn't be on the sex offender registry for life for certain sex crimes. It shouldn't be a life sentence. Well, it is a life sentence for the victims. It's a life sentence for them. They get to carry that with the rest of their fucking lives. And of course, Todd Wheeler's position, like most Mormon priesthood holders, is that the victims would just benefit from forgiving and forgetting and moving on. And the only reason they're still traumatized and they're carrying this around with them for the rest of their lives is because they just won't forgive their abuser. They just won't forgive them. Like, get the fuck out of here. Like, this is your elected representative. This is what the people of Woods Cross sent to the Utah State Senate to represent them. Make no mistake about it, it is representative of them. So when you look at Woods Cross, Utah, and you look at any of the places that these people are from, they were produced and molded in a culture that enabled them to say, like Judge Thomas Liv said, that a convicted rapist standing before him at a sentencing hearing is an extraordinarily good man. You should question the culture. You should question the upbringing that produces someone who could stare a convicted rapist in the eye in his courtroom and say that. Say that he's an extraordinarily good man. Rapists are not extraordinarily good men. They're shitty people. Anyone who rapes or molests another human being is a piece of shit. And they should be executed. They're not going to stop. They're not going to rehabilitate. They're not going to reform. They are a piece of shit. And they're disqualified from membership in civilized society. And they should be on a sex offender registry if you're not going to execute them for the rest of their fucking lives. And Todd Wheeler is a poor reflection on himself, but he's also a poor reflection on his constituents. But here's the thing. His constituents have repeatedly reelected him, so he is an accurate reflection of those constituents. His values reflect their values. And that's the uncomfortable truth that we don't want to face in the state of Utah, is that a sizable portion of the population agrees with Todd Wheeler, or Weiler, whatever his fucking name is. A sizable portion of the population agrees with this guy. And that reality is reflected in the process and the treatment of sexual abusers in the state of Utah and in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, because they don't receive letters from the church security office barring them from being on church-owned property. They don't receive those kinds of letters. But the people who report on the scourge of sexual abuse in this state, like Jason and Alexia Preston, do receive those types of letters. Anyone who questions the church's official history or doctrine, even though it's rooted in lies, they receive those types of letters. But the people who are raping kids, they don't receive those types of letters. They have free reign to be on church property. Time and time again, they have free access to church property to do whatever the hell they want. And so the rest of us who are stuck dealing with this, we have to navigate a culture that has normalized child rape and has also stigmatized calling it out. Calling out child sex predators for being predators. There's a man named Gordon Bowen who I am intimately familiar with as part of the Hamlin case, which has been my focus for about 4 years now. Gordon Hamlin shows up to all of the meetings for the planning of the reopening of the Salt Lake Temple in, I believe, 2027. And he is the creative director of that reopening. He was excommunicated from the church in 2003 in the aftermath of allegations that he sexually abused his 2 biological children, possibly abused his 2 stepchildren with his ex-wife Barbara Timothy, and also proven behavior, which proven in the form of phone records and everything submitted in his divorce as evidence, that he made thousands of calls to gay male escort lines, gay prostitution. At the time, he was an endowed Latter-day Saint, in good standing with the church. He had friendships with people like Gordon B. Hinckley and Boyd K. Packer and others, apostles in the church. He was supposed to have the kind of spiritual discernment necessary to recognize Gordon for what he was. But that's not the case. He had a raging pornography addiction. His 2 stepsons saw pornography on his computers. His dates were finding porn magazines, gay porn magazines, in his residence and confronting him about it. His friends of the same sex detailed how Gordon sexually assaulted them or made sexual advances to them. That's the man that the church has picked, a man who's been excommunicated for 23, going on 24 years. That's the man who the church picked to help oversee the creative side of the reopening of its Salt Lake Temple. These are prophets and apostles. And they socialize with Gordon. They go to his house in Holiday, Utah. They play pickleball with him. They rent the house for birthday parties and events. That's who they choose to do church business. So when we talk about the culture around this, Gordon Bowen, a child rapist, an alleged Satanist, an alleged child abuser, he has multiple accusers. His own friends and associates during his divorce filled out affidavits saying that they had seen him around teenage boys that he imported from Utah and elsewhere to New York to live with him in his private residence in exchange for fixing their teeth. One of them, Michelle Avantario, his former secretary, reportedly said she was worried the police were going to find the bodies of boys in Gordon's yard. Like, get the fuck out of here. The idea that the men leading the church have any spiritual discernment whatsoever when they allow Gordon Bowen, of all people, to be on their properties, to be in their properties, and to oversee their business while simultaneously issuing a letter from the church security office to journalists like Jason and Alexia Preston, in which they say, hey, you can't be on our property because you're reporting on the abuse committed by our members, and in some cases, our leadership, because one of their more recent guests alleged that his abuser was D. Todd Christofferson. One of his abusers was D. Todd Christofferson, who's in the first presidency. Like that's the fucking level. But hey, like the current president of the church, the current prophet, seer, and revelator, Dallin Oaks, says, the church doesn't seek apologies and it doesn't make apologies. The church does whatever the fuck it wants. I mean, why not? It has $250 billion in assets, which it uses to bludgeon and bully victims. That's the tripartite tomfoolery. You have the criminal justice system on the one hand in the state of Utah. You have the elected officials on the other hand in the state of Utah, and then you have the church. There is no separation of church and state in the state of Utah. The church actively tells legislators what legislation to advance and what legislation to strike down. And it's been doing that for the entire history of this state. It's always been the case because members of the church, I used to be one, take an oath of consecration in which they pledge to consecrate their time and talents and everything else the Lord has blessed them with to the building up of the church, the building up of God's kingdom. And so the idea that these legislators or any other elected official who also holds membership in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints could separate their membership in the church from their duties as a legislator, or their constitutional obligations, to separate those two things, that's laughable. We all know. It's right there in plain sight. And it is obvious where the church has cast its lot because, as I've said repeatedly throughout this episode, the church bans journalists like Jason and Alexia Preston and dissidents who question its official narratives from being on their property. They send letters from the church security office. Now, Jason and Alexia Preston didn't make any violent threats. They've explicitly disavowed violence and vigilantism. They want to trust the process. Well, it's not really working out well for them because now they can't even attend their church services because they've been banned from church properties. But the numerous child rapists and child abusers and sexual predators who have been exposed as a result of their reporting and as a result of other outlets like Floodlit highlighting it and IRA, those guys, they're still allowed on church property. David Lee Hamblin hasn't been banned from church property. He's on tape apologizing to his daughter, Catherine, for raping her. I am sorry for raping him. Those are his exact words. They couldn't achieve a conviction against him in Utah County in 2014, even with a taped acknowledgement that he raped his daughter. They couldn't achieve a conviction against him in 2022 to 2024 in the Sheets case because it might have involved ritual abuse. You met a satanic panic. He's still allowed on church property, as far as we know. Gordon Bowen is definitely allowed on church property. Lincoln, Kevin Kelly, and Khalil Kelly allowed on church property. Joseph Wood Benyon and Lee Benyon allowed on church property. David and Shalom Lovett allowed on church property. But if you question anything the church does as it relates to sexual predators or alleged sexual predators being allowed on church property, if you question the church turning a blind eye to serious allegations of sexual abuse, organized sexual abuse committed by individuals within groups, individuals who also hold membership in the church, if you question that, then guess what? A letter from the church security, and that letter bars you from stepping foot on church property. And that's what happened to Jason and Alexia Preston. They tried to go through the system. I tried to go to the system. I wrote ecclesiastical summaries of the allegations against certain individuals in the Hamlin victim statements and passed it up the chain. One of those individuals lost his calling for about a week, and then he was called to something else. He was ranting and raving on the phone because he got a demotion to greeting people. He was ranting and raving on the phone to his son-in-law, who's also his attorney, talking about, suing the church because he got demoted in a calling. But the allegations against this individual should at the very least trigger an internal investigation. A normal institution or organization, they would trigger an investigation and an inquiry into what exactly this individual has been doing. I mean, in his civil filings, this individual has acknowledged that he used peyote. He's acknowledged that he used drugs in the context of Indian religious ceremonies. That's an apostate position for a Latter-day Saint. You can't hold dual membership in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and in a Native American church in which you use a controlled substance, a Schedule I controlled substance, state and federal law can't use a controlled substance in the course of your mystical mumbo-jumbo religious ceremonies with the Indians and also hold simultaneous membership in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which has something called the Word of Wisdom. We aren't even supposed to drink coffee. That is, if you're a current member. I'm an ex-mo. So I get to drink coffee. I don't use drugs. I don't drink alcohol. I don't consume tobacco. But you know what? That's the church. It's not about making sense. And as Dallas Oaks has said, the church does not seek apologies and the church does not make apologies. The church does whatever the fuck it wants. And if you don't like it, kick rocks. Eat a dick. If you don't like the fact that we don't ban child sexual predators and child rapists from our property, but we ban journalists who report on allegations of child rape, well, tough shit. Tough titties. That's the clown world that we live in. And that's the clown world that produces people like Todd Wheeler, or Weiler, or whatever his name is. A state senator from Woods Cross who wanted to reduce the time on the sex offender registry for certain sexual offenders because he didn't feel like their sexual abuse should be a life sentence. I mean, that's too harsh. It's too draconian for him. Unless you think that Todd is alone. You know, I'm going to start calling him Toad Wheeler. That's what he is. Toad. Unless you think Toad is alone. Our next example is the Utah State Senate President, Stuart Adams. Now, Stuart found himself in a bit of a pickle recently because his step-granddaughter, Abigail Marie Ross, was an 18-year-old high school senior who took it upon herself to fuck a 13-year-old. She took it upon herself to have sex with a 13-year-old boy. Now, 13-year-olds in the state of Utah are beneath the lowered age of consent of 14. So Utah bifurcates sex offenses between those who are under the age of 14 and those who are between 14 and 18. 14 and under 18. So there are stiffer penalties for those who have sex with someone who's under 14 years of age, which Abigail Marie Ross did. So Abigail Marie Ross decided to have sex with a 13-year-old boy. And under Utah's laws, that's child rape. She was facing a very stiff penalty of potentially 25 years to life for what she did. And under the statute, because she was over 18, the consequences were potentially severe. So she and her attorney, Cara Tangaro, who is also the attorney of David Lee Hamlin's ex-wife, Roselle Stevenson, stonewalled and delayed until the law could be changed because her grandfather, Stuart Adams, Jabez Stuart Adams, he's the Senate president. And so Stuart Adams enlisted his friend Kirk Cullimore, slumdog or slumlord millionaire, because Kirk Cullimore runs a law firm that ultimately tries to secure judgments and garnishments against people who are in debt in the state of Utah. Woo that. He enlisted Kirk Cullimore to change the child rape statute so that if someone was 18 and still in high school, they would be eligible for a lighter sentence. Because his granddaughter, his step-granddaughter, Abigail Marie Ross, chose to fuck a 13-year-old boy. It's what she did. And so the law couldn't apply retroactively, but it was, in effect, applied retroactively. Multiple judges recused themselves from this case, obviously, because it was a hot potato. And they didn't want to run afoul of Jabez, Abigail's step-granddad. So, ultimately, Abigail got a lesser sentence, even though the law at the time of her offense would have called for a much stiffer sentence. And she didn't do additional jail time. She didn't do additional prison time. She received a suspended sentence, and she was not forced to go on the sex offender registry. Because her grandfather had the law changed. He enlisted his friends in the Utah Senate to have the law changed. And then, of course, afterwards, Governor Spencer Cox, who is gay and has a proclivity for very young boys himself, it's an open secret that he's been caught having sex with other men. Multiple people who will privately attest to it, but they won't publicly attest to it because this is Utah. This is a clown world. Governor Spencer Cox said he's been mad at Stuart Adams so many times, like over the course of legislative issues, that he couldn't even see straight. But this was not one of those times. This change in the law, which would allow an 18-year-old who's still in high school to be eligible for a lighter sentence under Utah's child rape statute. This was not one of the times that Spencer Cox was mad at Stuart Adams or upset with Stuart Adams for using his position in his relationships in the Utah State Senate to change the law to benefit his daughter or his step-granddaughter who chose to have sex with a 13-year-old. That's Utah. That's Utah. And so, Rise to Liberty. Jacob Johnson, longtime friend of the show, he says, I always called myself a Jack Mormon. Well, a lot of your Mormons with temple recommends are also Jack Mormons because they don't keep their covenants. They're addicted to pornography. Oh, I'm addicted. I'm addicted to porn. Well, you're not addicted to shit. You're making a deliberate choice to look at that, and in doing so, you are diverting time from your wife, your family, and in some cases, if you're Gordon Bowen, you're looking at porn at work, on work computers. That's allegedly why he was fired from Sundance. He also had that problem at multiple advertising agencies that he worked at. So you're diverting time. Your bosses don't pay you to view porn and jerk off at work. But that's what Gordon Bowen did. He was excommunicated in 2003 for all of his sexual proclivities that were out of alignment with the church's teachings, which also constituted adultery because he was married. And he had gay male escorts coming to his hotel room while he had his daughter with him. That's in his divorce papers. He went to the Grand America Hotel. He made multiple calls to escorts, but he said he couldn't recall or remember if the escorts actually showed up. And that's while he had his infant daughter with him. And his wife was recovering from IVF to have their second child, their son. So, ultimately, with Gordon Bowen and with other Latter-day Saint men, they're Jack Mormons too. I mean, on the surface, they have temple recommends. They're Latter-day Saints in good standing. Stands to reason that they're fine, upstanding men, but privately, they're sexual degenerates. Privately, they have what they call a porn addiction. They're addicted to porn. They're addicted. They can't help it. They can't help their addiction. They become dependent. on porn. Truth is, most of them close their eyes to finish with their wives, thinking about their favorite porn scene because they're just that deviant. The number of Latter-day Saint women I've talked to whose husbands developed erectile dysfunction because they couldn't perform sexually because it wasn't porn. Couldn't have sex with their wives. They didn't even want to take medication for it. That's the level of depravity in this state and in this church. The restored church, the only true church. Rash Liver Jacob in the chat, they aren't addicted, they are weak. Well, fuck yeah, they're weak. They're not even weak. I mean, they have a very strong inclination and a very strong will to look at that shit on the internet in all of its forms. I have to deal with social media. Like, my reels generally are tweaked to the point where it's just animals, engines, smoked meat, and guitars. That sort of thing. And every 2 weeks or so, Facebook tries to, stick in, like, what I call the whores. Because that's basically what it is. A bunch of women, like, dancing in front of the camera, like, trying to get attention from men. And you have to scroll through it real quickly and make sure that, your algorithm is actually content that you actually want. But they do constantly try to push that. And, of course, as with all things, if you stare at it long enough, if you watch it long enough, more of it will show up in your reels. More of it will show up in your social media content. But if you scroll right past it, because of the way the algorithm's set, it's, one or two and done. That's been my experience. Your reels are set to what you actually watch. So if there's a honey badger video that you watch for an extended period of time, they send you more honey badger videos. That's something that has driven my wife nuts as she lays in bed with me, because it's all honey badgers fighting other animals lately. The honey badger is a badass animal. And why wouldn't I want to watch that over Facebook whores or Insta whores? Like, why would I want to watch a badger fighting a leopard? That's some badass content right there. So I have a strong inclination to just focus on my wife. The time that I spend is how you know where my values and priorities are. So obviously IRA is a value or a priority to me. The content across the various sites that I write for, that's a priority. My work is a priority. Providing for my family is a priority, but between 5:30 and 8:30 to 9 each night, that's with my wife. It's family time. She gets me for those 3 hours without exception. Saturdays between about 9 and 2:30 before she winds down and wants to take a nap, that's her time. Sundays, that's her time. So you know your priorities by how you invest your time. And my priorities are self-evident in how I spend my time. And I don't have time to divert from my wife and my work, the things that I do to provide and make money. I don't have time to divert from that. My health is a priority. I spend a lot of time in doctor's offices getting treatment for my various health ailments. I'm trying to stay alive for my wife and my kid and my family. And these men who want to sit around for hours jerking off to porn, their priorities are that over their family and everything else. These people who want to use and abuse drugs and alcohol, that's where your priorities are. That's how you want to spend your time. So don't try to say that it wasn't a willful or deliberate decision on your part, or that you're weak or anything else. You made that choice. Own it. You made the choice to prioritize a substance or porn over your wife and your kids and your job. That's where your priorities lie, and we know it because of how much time you invest in it and how much money you spend on it. At one point, Utah was the number one state for paid pornography subscriptions. That's the fucking level in this state. That's the tomfoolery of this state. So I don't want to hear any more of this bullshit about Utah being a good state or anything. Like, we put our house on the market, we're get down to the state. And I would recommend anybody else to do the same. Go somewhere that reflects your values. And for me, that's the South. Like, if you abuse a child in the state of Alabama, you go to fucking pound me in the ass prison. Like, it's just that simple. And you don't last. They take you to the top of the unit after they have their fun with you, and they drop you. And if you live, you live. If you die, you die. I'm not saying that it's right, but I am saying that it's just. Alabama inmates have a greater sense of morality and a greater sense of right and wrong than Stuart Adams. Because his step-granddaughter, Abigail Marie Ross, belongs in prison. She belongs in a sex offender registry for the rest of her life for fucking a 13-year-old boy. She had no business doing that. As a Latter-day Saint, presumably she's raised in a Latter-day Saint household because Stuart Adams has been very open about how his faith has impacted his life and his decisions. He's an active Latter-day Saint. Abigail Marie Ross had no reason to violate the law of chastity, which is absolute for all Latter-day Saints. I mean, the rules are clear. And one of the reasons that attracted me as a convert is that the LDS Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, had a higher standard. And the saints that I was around at least exemplified and met that standard in their personal conduct and behavior, in their dealings with others. They were straight up. I cannot say, even now, enough good things about Latter-day Saints that I met and interacted with in Texas and Florida. But when I came to Utah, this is not the same church. These are not the same members. And they don't manifest or abide by the same rules. And the church as an institution is a fucking disgrace. To send a letter to Jason and Alexia Preston barring them for being on church-owned properties for reporting about sexual abuse, while allowing people who perpetuate sexual abuse, either by committing that sexual abuse or by covering it up, to be on church property with impunity. That's the fucking level. I am aware of any number of things that don't constitute abuse, but are against the law of chastity and the church's doctrine and its teachings that are supposed to govern the conduct of its membership. Things like swinging and open marriages, that burst into the mainstream with the Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, that trashy-ass show that apparently is on hiatus because guess what? You know, the women of that show are trash. They engage in fucking domestic abuse and God knows what. Up to and including not realizing that the furniture they're throwing at their partner, who they're without a wedlock sexually, the furniture they're throwing at them hits their kid. Like that, those are the pieces of shit that represent you. And they represent you accurately. If you're in Utah. Based on what I've seen over the past 4 years. Like Taylor, Frankie Paul, or whatever her name is. She's not isolated. I know of at least one Mormon who's prominent. You see his name all over billboards and everything. Um, he had 13 affairs in his first marriage. He's still having affairs. I looked into him for a private client. Like, the things that I uncovered about him went far beyond affairs. I still look at him from time to time. I'm still looking at the information I found in there because some of it points to him being involved in other activity that is criminal. 13 affairs. I'm aware of another prominent Latter-day Saint or excommunicated Latter-day Saint at this point who had a boom boom room in his mansion where he and other people had adulterous activities. I mean, that's normal among the elites of this state. It's not isolated. And I don't question those elites. I question the culture that produced them. There's certain things that I wouldn't be involved in because of how I was raised. And I will say this about my dad. He was a physically abusive guy. But thank God I was raised by him because he was always black and white about sexual mores and norms. And he was absolutely adamant that porn had no place in life. The life of somebody who was a Christian, that adultery had no place in the life of somebody who was a Christian. My dad was absolutely black and white about that, and it stuck with me. I didn't cheat on my girlfriends or my spouses. I did look at porn when I was younger. But as I committed to the church and to Christ, those things fell away. And that is how I know I am truly in Christ. Is because my life reflects it. The fruits of my life reflect it. The things that I do in my life reflect my commitment to Christ. And I'm absolute about sexual chastity and sexual morality and sexual purity in my life. Sex is for my wife. And only for my wife. Flirting is for my wife and only for my wife. There's no place in my life for anything else. The Bible says to flee sexual immorality, and I do. I'm not alone with women other than my wife in private settings or private places. If I have to meet a female source, it's done in a public place. It's very clear where the lines are. There's no confusion here. And so when you talk about the tomfoolery, you talk about the clown world that we live in. And the examples that I presented to the judges and politicians in this live stream. It's not hard to understand why it's wrong. There's not a single instance, not a single credibly documented instance where a pedophile or a rapist rehabilitated. None. Doesn't exist. So the idea that they should just go to prison for a little while and they're going to come out rehabilitated and somehow deterred, that's bullshit. There's no empirical basis for that. There's no empirical basis to say that through the power of the priesthood, the mystical, magical, mumbo-jumbo Mormon priesthood, that you're going to heal a pedophile or a rapist. And the Bible says those of us who come to a knowledge of the truth and then continue to willfully engage in our prior lives, like, we are irredeemable. We know what the truth is, we reject it, and we continue to partake of the fruits of darkness. We continue to go back on our word. We continue to exploit others. We continue to engage in sexual immorality and drunkenness and whoring. All of these things are linked to idolatry in the epistles, the New Testament. So when you see them listed out, when you see lists or categorizations of sin, and they're together, it's always in the context of idolatry. Because that's what you worship. You worship a false god. And the ordinances of a false god, the ordinance of the devil, the ordinances of this world involve immorality on some level. It involves the exploitation of another person without their consent, sexually and otherwise. It involves manipulating other people through fraud. It involves being underhanded, not honest and forthright in your dealings with other people. It involves all of these things. And we all know what the church worships by its fruits. No church that is of God would cover for sexual predators in its midst. No church that was true would bar someone who exposes sexual abuse from its properties while allowing someone who commits sexual abuse to enter into its properties and to be covered for by bishops and stake presidents and church authorities. Make no mistake about it, this church worships the devil. That's why I started calling it the Church of Latter-day Satanists. Because that's what it is. There is no good or innocent reason for why the church would ban Jason and Alexia Preston from its premises or any of the properties it owns, but not do the same for the numerous predators who've been revealed by outlets like IRA or We Are the People Utah or Floodlit or any number of the other people out there doing this work, like LDS Abuse, Justin Riggs. Rise to Liberty has been a prominent ally in this. We're starting to see others join the fight more and more. We're starting to see people on Twitter go ham on this issue. I just got a text from my sister, and that's never good. Well, it appears that my other sister has been committed again. You talk about the legacy of abuse in a familial sense, in what it produces. I can tell you firsthand in my family, I have a sister who has repeatedly had mental health issues, and part of it is the fact that our house was defined by physical and sexual abuse and other forms of abuse. And she just didn't have the temperament to withstand it. And her entire adult life has been defined by it, and that is why it is so important to protect and shield children from any form of abuse. It's why parents need to be raised up in Christ. It's why families are so important. Christian families are so important. That is, families that actually walk the walk instead of just talking the talk. And my dad wanted to be Christ-like. But he just didn't have the tools. His dad was a perpetual adulterer. His mom dumped him at his relative's house so that she could take up with a younger man when her second marriage imploded. One of the many times it imploded. She just dumped him with relatives, his aunt and uncle. And that was the first time he'd ever been to church. That was his first exposure to it. So he had an example. Now, he rejected the adultery of his father and everything else, but the physical abuse, the anger, he adapted that in his own life. And he and my mother, when um, we raised this issue with them, both children and adults, and we protested against the severity of their abusive discipline and other things. Their reply was, what you're going through is nowhere near as bad as what we went through in our upbringing. We're doing the best that we can, and that might be true. But it's still wrong to discipline your kid in anger. It's still wrong to punish your kid out of anger as opposed to trying to correct their behavior. Still wrong, no matter what it is. And I've got a sister who's probably permanently broken as a result of that. You know, I pray for her. My other siblings pray for her. We try to help her in any way that we can, and unfortunately, there are very few ways to help a sibling who's mentally ill without enabling them. If anybody knows how to do that without destroying them further, please let me know in the comments or at Goel at investigationsofritualabuse.com. I would love to know. I'm open to suggestions on how to help my sister. Ultimately, that's the problem with tolerating this kind of abuse, is it breaks people permanently. It's not just about politics or the church that you're a part of. Like, tolerating this kind of abuse or enabling this kind of abuse creates broken children who grow up into broken adults, and those broken adults, they don't experience any of the good things in life for very long, if at all. They're always on fire, mentally and emotionally, and they never know any peace. They never know never know productive lives or joyful lives. They're always like stuck in this loop of talking about their abuse, talking about their trauma, but they never have good relationships or good anything, really. My sister has said that she's a lesbian. I don't know if she is or she isn't. That's what she identifies as. She talks about her parents. Every conversation I've ever had with her over the past 10 years has been about things that our parents did, and I understand it. That's how she's processing the abuse that we went through. But that's the sole topic of conversation she has for me. There's never any new development in her life. There's never anything good in her life. It's just what she went through as a kid and how it's impacted her. Functioning families are so important in this. And the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and other ecclesiastical institutions, by no means am I saying that this is limited to that church. I am saying that when you tolerate abusers and you allow them on your property while barring people who speak against it or who advocate against it or who expose it, like Jason, Alexia Preston, myself, and others, when you bar those people who are adamantly against abuse, but you allow the abusers free access to your property, it speaks volumes as to where your priorities are. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints would rather conceal the exposure of abuse. They'd rather conceal the abuse as opposed to putting it out there in the open. Because if it's out there in the open, the full extent of this abuse within its ranks, guess what? People are going to realize that the church's leaders have no spiritual discernment whatsoever. They're a bunch of prophets who don't prophesy. They don't have any spiritual discernment. They don't know their ass from their elbow. They don't know the difference between good people and bad people. And even when it is the bad people admit that they're bad, they self-disclose the abuse. The church keeps it internal. They tell the victims that they have to forgive, even though their abusers never asked for forgiveness and never showed any contrition whatsoever. How do you make restitution for an impacted colon in a 6-year-old? What dollar amount would you put on that? How do you make atonement for that? How do you apologize for permanently damaging the GI tract of a 6 or 7-year-old that you raped, that you violently sodomized? How do you make up for the fact that that's their first sexual experience? How do you do that? They're just supposed to forgive you. And through forgiving you, they will magically be healed and made whole. Well, when you read medical reports from gynecologists and forensic examiners who have done full-scope medical exams on victims, and they describe the vaginal canal of a female victim as looking like shredded meat because they were so horrifically abused. When they talk about scarring on a grown woman's cervix, that is caused by sexual abuse like object rape. You read that and it's not a clinical thing to you, because the abuse that caused that occurred when she was between like 6 and 13 years of age. How does one apologize for that and make someone whole? It's a fucking clown position to sit there and tell a victim they have to forgive someone for that. You have permanently altered their body and their physiology, and more than that, you've permanently altered them in terms of their emotions. And so fuck the church. Fuck the abusers. Fuck these people. The rest of us shouldn't have to live like this. We shouldn't have to live with our church banning people who expose sexual abuse and who bring it out in the open and demand accountability. Those people should not be the ones banned from the properties owned by their church. And the fact that the church does that to them, but not to the abusers, is a sign that the church is in open apostasy. If you're going to be a member of the club, you should follow its rules. And that means if you're having sex, it should only be with your spouse in a lawful marriage. And in the marriage, according to the church, between a biological male and a biological woman. And if you step outside of that in any way, then you should be excommunicated. You know what the truth is. In many cases, you were raised in the truth with respect to the law of chastity and other doctrines that have a strong scriptural basis. And you rejected it. So we know who your Lord is. We know who you follow by your actions. And you shouldn't be able to set foot on the property. You should be excommunicated. You should be shunned for that. But that's not what's happening. If you're a child rapist and you go to your bishop in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and you confess your sins like what you have done, first off, you know it's wrong. That's why you're in the bishop's office talking about it, trying to gain some absolution for it. You know it's wrong. That's why you went to your bishop. And ultimately, the church decides to cover for you. It sends you to a little counseling, through LDS social services, and it's therapists who are not going to report, even though they are, according to state law, mandatory reporters. So they're going to send you to therapy. You might be disfellowshipped, you might be excommunicated, but you know what? You will be rebaptized within a year or two. And you'll go right back into callings where you have access to children. And your victims will be told that they just have to forgive you and move on. And by the way, according to Richard Scott, at some point in the process, you as a victim might realize your own role in your abuse and your need to atone for it. Like, the fuck is going on in this church and in this state? And how do people not make the link between what's going on in this state and a church that is a complete moral abomination? Todd Wheeler, Stuart Adams, Judge Thomas Lowe, Judge Don Torgerson, Judge Catherine Conklin, these people didn't occur in a vacuum. These people didn't reach this point of absolute depraved reasoning and indifference, reprobate reasoning, to where they could look like Judge Catherine Conklin did. A man named Colton Johansson is a police officer who admitted to having abused an infant in 1994, raping an infant, and say, you're not a danger to your community. That's reprobate reasoning. And it didn't come from their rejection of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its righteous teaching. It came from their embrace of it. At Colton Johansson's sentencing, his abuser, who was now his abuse victim, who was now an adult, stood up and said he forgave him. And that didn't happen in a vacuum either. And it's irrelevant. Like, you can personally forgive your abuser all you want. But at the same time, what Colton Johansson did was a crime. He forcibly sexually abused an infant, and he should fucking go to prison for it. Not get 30 days in jail and some time in home confinement. He fucked an infant. He should go straight to prison for that. Doesn't matter how long ago it was. Doesn't matter that he's currently a highly decorated officer with his police department. All that matters is he committed a crime. And that crime is particularly egregious. And that's just the crime he admitted to. He admitted to fucking an infant in 1994. He admitted to that. And then he also admitted to having child porn from his work as a police officer in a sex crimes task force. He had child porn in his garage, and he was pleasuring himself to pornographic material in his garage. Now, he insists that all the pornographic material that he extracted from those files involved adults, against the context of admitting that he fucked a kid in 1994. The credulity of the credulous is strained by this. Just, and the idea that Catherine Conklin, the judge in his case, could look him in the eye and look the rest of us in the eye and say he's not a danger to the community is just bullshit. And the root of this comes from the fact that Utah is a Mormon state. It comes from the fact that Utahns are conditioned to have this attitude that everyone is redeemable no matter how egregious what they did was. They're redeemable. They're salvageable. That comes directly from the church. And the idea that Colton Johansson is not a danger to the community is fucking laughable. This is a dude who fucked an infant in 1994. It doesn't matter that his victim is now an adult and forgives him. It doesn't matter. Like, it is a crime. He needs to go to prison. Not get 30 days in jail and I think another 60 days on home confinement. He needs to go to fucking prison for what he did. He needs to stay there for a very long time, if not the rest of his life. And if you're Judge Thomas Lowe and you want to talk about Keith Robert Vallejo, convicted rapist, at his sentencing hearing, you want to call him an extraordinarily good man in front of his victim. That comes directly. That level of insensitivity, that level of reprobate reasoning comes from your association with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, because they have the same fucking attitude. They'll ban anybody from their properties who exposes this or who reports on it, like they did with Jason Alexia Preston, but someone who actually sexually abuses children and adults, that person has free access to the church property, as long as they don't question the church on doctrine or process or anything else that the church does. As long as they keep their mouth shut and they don't question what the church does, they can visit the property anytime. They can be on property anytime. And very few people around them have any idea of the fact that they're a sexual predator, because the bishopric and the stake presidencies and the church itself suppress any exposure of that, suppress any public knowledge of that. Like, that's what we're dealing with in the state of Utah. We're dealing with a tripartite tomfoolery of the church on the one hand, the politicians on the other, and the criminal justice system. And so if you're someone who is sexually abused and you go outside of the church and you report to law enforcement, guess what? Your entire ward family is going to ostracize you. They're going to call you the problem, not the person who raped you, but you. You're going to be the problem. And if you're raped by your bishop, as was the case with Keith Robert Vallejo and the two women that he sexually abused, the judge is going to look him in the eye at the sentencing hearing. He's going to get visibly choked up, and he's going to call your rapist an extraordinarily good man in front of you. That's the fucking level. And you can listen to, as an abuse victim, as someone who's been raped or sexually abused, you can listen to someone like Todd Wheeler, talk about how your rapist shouldn't be on the sex offender registry for life, because that's too severe. Is sexual abuse of you shouldn't be a life sentence. That's the reprobate reasoning here. And so Toad Wheeler is going to say this kind of shit publicly. He's going to go to bat for sexual abusers and sex offenders, because, they're people too. And more than 10 years is just too harsh. It's just too much. It's just too much. It's too severe. It should be a life sentence. Shouldn't be a life sentence. Should just not be a life sentence because, as Judge John Torgerson said, 112 days in jail is a lot for someone with Aiden Hoffman's level of privilege. This guy from Maine who came to Utah had over 600 files of child sexual abuse material, already facing another criminal case in Maine. But he's a man from a privileged background, so 112 days, that's a lot of jail time for someone of Aiden Hoffman's level of privilege. That's sufficient. But us people who don't have that level of privilege, those of us who are hard scrabble guys, got to fight and claw. Like, we need a more severe prison term because, we're accustomed to hardship. So 112 days wouldn't be enough for us. We don't have that privilege, We're just regular people. That's the level of bullshit reasoning in this state. And it comes from being a member of the church. That reprobate reasoning, that just absolute stupidity that's present at all levels of the church, the arrogance and the certitude that accompanies it is present at all levels of the church. Because as Dallin Oaks, the current president of the church, said, the church does not seek apologies, nor does it issue apologies. Church doesn't apologize. It doesn't ask for forgiveness. Neither does Judge John Torgerson or Stuart Adams or Todd Wheeler. Judge Catherine Conklin doesn't ask for an apology. Judge Thomas Lowe doesn't ask for an apology. He certainly doesn't issue them. Because guess what? These people they're impervious. They're immune to culpability. They'll always stand. They're not directly elected. Judges in the state of Utah aren't. They're going to be reappointed every single time. By the time it comes around for the voters to vote on whether or not to sustain, or whatever, I forget what it's called. So let me look it up. It's a very specific term, but anyway, judges in Utah every few years, after they're appointed to a district court, the voters go to the polls, and they're ultimately, it's retention. That's what it is. So the voters vote to retain judges. So if they get a majority of the yes votes, they remain in office for 6 years. That's the term. Supreme Court justices, they get 10-year terms. So by the time it gets around to a retention election, the public has largely forgotten what these judges did, if they ever really know, if they were ever really paying attention. And so the clown world that we live in basically enables this. I mean, that's the level. So all of these judges, they're gonna win their retention election. Judge Torgerson, Mr., 112 days in jail is a lot for a young man of your privilege who has 600 plus files of child sexual abuse material. It's a lot of time for a privileged individual. Judge Catherine Conklin, you're not a danger to the community even though you fuck babies and you have child porn in your garage and you're a cop. She's going to be retained. Judge Thomas Lowe, who calls a convicted rapist in his courtroom an extraordinarily good man in front of his victims, he's going to be retained. And of course, the Utah legislature will make hay. They'll censure these people. They'll be outraged for all of 5 minutes. They'll do their part. They won't remove them from office. They won't mount any effective opposition to them remaining in office. They'll engage in the window dressing of being outraged. Morally reprehensible. They'll go through the motions of that, and they'll it'll be performative, and the public will be like, yeah, my legislature is with me on this, and they're just as disgusted by it. But what can we do? We don't want to change the retention. We don't want them to be directly elected. Like, we don't want to shorten their terms so they're more accountable to voters. No, we want them to be nonpartisan. We want them to be independent. Everybody knows that's bullshit. They're not independent. They're not nonpartisan. They're appointed by a partisan governor and confirmed by a partisan Senate. And everybody knows that there's only one party in the state of Utah, and that is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That's the only, all the rest of it is just bullshit. That's how you get somewhere in Utah politics. That's how you get a judgeship. You're a member in good standing of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and if you are a member in good standing of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who commits impropriety or sexual abuse, then guess what? You're insulated from accountability. But the people who expose you, the people who report on it, their accountability is, like Jason and Alexia Preston, they get a letter from the church security office barring them from church property because they're the real danger. Not the people who rape and fuck kids, who are endowed members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who don't live the principle, who are Jack Mormons, as Jacob Johnson said earlier in this podcast. Those people, they're fucking immune from culpability. They get to attend whatever church-owned property they please. In fact, many of them get to fuck kids on those properties. I mean, a substantial number of civil suits that I've looked at over the past 4 or 5 years, allege that members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints were having sex with kids in meeting houses and stake centers. Those people don't get barred from church-owned property. They don't get the kind of letter that Jason and Alexia Preston got. And, you know, their path to repentance and restoration is handled privately. They don't get barred from church property. Like, in the chat, Jacob Johnson again. The rest of you, let's have a little diversity in the chat. Somebody else posts. Something people don't understand about this is they genuinely, that is the abusers, genuinely believe this trauma is a good thing. They believe that causing dissociation is bringing the victim closer to God. Well, I don't know. I don't know who Jacob's been talking to. Most of the victims and alleged abusers that I've spoken to, the victims talk about eventually, if they progress far enough and they don't get out, the way it's explained to them is that they have to be equally proficient in both good and evil. His Heavenly Father is an exalted man, is equally proficient, good and evil. That's how he progressed to exaltation and Godhead. Godhead is he was equally knowledgeable about both good and evil. And so the people in these satanic groups operating within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the reason they hold dual membership is because they want to be proficient in the good. That is, they want to be a member in good standing of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but they also, on the other hand, want to be a good member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They want to straddle the fence, so to speak, and they want to be equally proficient in both areas. Moral depravity and moral goodness. And they induce dissociation in their children, and they enable dissociation in themselves by doing this, because there is no way you can serve two masters unless you are dissociated in their minds. I can't wrap my head around it. I can't really. I look at it as fucking crazy because that's what it is, according to any normal person. When someone articulates this to you, as though there's a justification or a method to this madness, your reaction is, "That's a fucking felony. You should go to prison." And second, it's just the revulsion that someone would sexualize a child. Someone would use a child for their own sexual gratification and enjoyment in any context. I don't give a shit about the mystical mumbo jumbo side of this. That you want to worship Satan, and part of worshiping Satan is that you sexually abuse children. I really don't give a shit. It's a crime. It's a felony. And you should go to prison for the safety of not only your children that you're abusing, but other children, because these ritual abusers, if you'll abuse a child in a ritual context, you'll abuse a child in a non-ritual context as well. You're a predator. It's that simple. And, the reality of it is, for the good of society, these people need to go away. I advocate for capital punishment. Other people find that to be too far or too much. I don't apologize for it. I believe there's one cure for pedophilia, and that is execution. It's the only thing that's going to stop them from raping kids, is if they're dead. And the same thing with adult rape. The only thing that's going to stop an adult rapist who rapes other adults is if you execute him. And I do not support parasitizing the taxpayers to incarcerate these people at $30,000 to $60,000 a year, depending on the state they're in. In Utah, I've seen estimates of incarceration per inmate cost of up to $70,000 a year per inmate. And I just don't believe that we should be spending our resources incarcerating them. They should be executed. Like, it's enough. You rape somebody, you do not pass go, you do not collect $200, you should be executed, whether they're an adult or a child. You possess child sexual abuse material, the production of that material involves the sexual abuse of a child. There's no way around it. You were an accessory after the fact. You shouldn't be charged just for the possession. You should be charged for the abuse, because you're creating a demand for that supply. And the production of that supply involves sexually victimizing a child. So fuck you. There's no forgiveness here. God forgives. And I'm glad he forgave me. But I didn't fuck a kid. I'm not an ongoing threat to society in the sense that sexual predators are. And the church is angrier at people like me than it is at people who sexually abuse kids. Just that simple. Jacob, Rise to Liberty, is in the chat again. Yes, because they believe it brings them closer to God. That's why Ralph Underwigger said what he did. He just said it out loud. For those of you who don't know, Ralph Underwigger was a psychologist, I believe, and also a board member of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, founded by Peter Freyd and his wife. Peter Freyd was accused of sexually abusing his own daughter, and he and his wife preemptively decided to create a foundation. They called it the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. False memory, it's not a syndrome. It's not a phenomenon that is scientifically validated. That's why the APA doesn't recognize it, and that's why the DSM doesn't include it. It's not a syndrome. It's not a thing. There's not empirically or scientifically validated, and therefore it doesn't exist. Nevertheless, the Freud family started the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, and Ralph Underweger and his wife Alida Wakefield were two of their members, and they gave a now infamous interview to a Dutch pedophilia magazine called Pedica, in which Ralph Underweger said that pedophiles were too defensive, that pedophilia was a responsible choice, and it was God's will. I mean, the interview is up on investigationritualabuse.com. I have the exact issue of Pedica in which Underweger and his wife interviewed with that magazine, which fully advocated for the normalization of pedophilia and sex between children and adults. That's the fucking level of the clown world that we're in. And so millions of victims got to watch the False Memory Syndrome Foundation rise and ascend. The expert witnesses, such as Ralph Underweger and Elizabeth Loftus, who testified on behalf of pedophiles as expert witnesses to discredit victims in child sexual abuse cases, both civilly and criminally. They testified in hundreds of cases. And they testified as to the validity of false memories, which weren't. It's not a valid syndrome. It's not scientifically recognized. But they still undercut dozens of abuse victims with their anti-science, completely baseless ideas about false memories, that you can implant memories in children, false memories, and that's what this abuse is. That's what these abuse allegations are. It's just a false memory. The therapist just implanted the memory in the victim's head, and they're falsely accusing their abuser, and isn't that terrible? And by the way, pedophilia is a responsible choice. It's God's will. That's what Ralph Underweger said. That's a guy who was, that's a guy who was an expert witness in countless cases, along with Elizabeth Loftus, another board member. And that's who Peter Freud and his wife chose to be on their board. He wasn't the only one. There were others on the False Memory Syndrome board who were sympathetic, if not outright endorsers of pedophilia. And it turns out that Peter Freud actually tried to sexually assault and threaten one of his graduate students with a knife, because that graduate student turned him down for sex. That's the founder of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. And by the way, his daughter was backed up by her uncle, Peter Freud's brother, in terms of her allegations of abuse. She coined the term DARVO. That is deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. She coined that term to typify or describe how victims are treated. And so, ultimately, as you look at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints approach, deny that sexual abuse exists in any great number or with any great frequency within the church, attack the victims. Oh, they're just ex-Mormons, they're disgruntled, they're apostates, and they don't want to follow the church's rules or processes. Well, why would they? You're letting their victims off the hook. You're obstructing criminal investigations into those victims. You're trying to deter the victims from reporting to law enforcement. You attack those victims. Their wards turn against them if they go to the police. And then you reverse the victim and the offender. It's not the actual rapist who's the problem. It's the victim who's the problem for going to the police, for agitating for more punishment for their offender, their abuser. They're the ones that are the problem. Fucking mouthy Mormon women or ex-Mormon women or mouthy ex-Mormon victims who were raped as kids by prominent Mormons, sexually abused. Those guys are the issue. That's what the church does. It's Darvo. Deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. They have been harsher towards Jason Alexia Preston and others who have raised questions about this than they have been towards the actual abusers in their ranks. Those abusers, I'm not aware of any of them being barred from church property. But Jason Alexia Preston, podcasters who report on the issue of sexual abuse, they've been banned from church property. That's the fucking level here in the state of Utah. It's the level that an endowed Temple Recommends member like Todd Wheeler can say, it should be a life sentence. Sex offenses shouldn't mandate a life sentence in the form of a lifetime on the sex offender registry. It should only be 10 years. These poor offenders, life sentence. Their victims get a life sentence. Their victims have to deal with the repercussions of sexual assault all day, every day. It impacts every relationship that they have. It impacts all of their friendships. Does their offender bear the cost of all the therapy and medication that they undergo? No. Their victim doesn't pay a dime. Their offender doesn't pay a dime. Their abuser doesn't pay a dime. The church doesn't pay a fucking dime for any of it. Even though in some cases the occurred on church property, that's a big example of why the church should ban sex offenders from its property, or people who confess to sexual abuse of children and other adults. Those people have no place on church property, but they aren't banned. The church tries to rehabilitate and restore them. But somebody who speaks out against it, like Jason Alexia Preston, they're barred from attending sacrament service and Sunday school and elders quorum because they're the problem. They just don't trust the church's process, and why would they? The church's process shield abusers from culpability, and we know that. We know that Todd Christofferson, who was accused recently of being a rapist, he has a brother who has sexually abused multiple children across multiple wards and states. And that brother was previously excommunicated. But then he was rebaptized, and he was restored to callings that gave him access to children. And the imprimatur of rebaptism, the imprimatur of those callings, is that he's safe. And so the families in the wards and stakes that he served after his rebaptism, they had no clue that Wade Christofferson had sexually preyed upon children beforehand. And so he was free to do it with impunity until he got caught by federal authorities. And D. Todd Christofferson wanted to say, I didn't know until like 2020 what was going on with my brother. I didn't know back in the 90s my brother was having all of these problems. I didn't know. It's not my fault. Well, maybe you didn't know because you weren't looking at it. And the people in your ward that I've spoken to say that you're, at the very least, a gay man. At the very least. I mean, you already have another brother who's an openly gay man. That's part of your little origin story as a member of the first presidency, is that you're LGBTQ friendly because your brother is openly gay. He's your token of tolerance. But church doctrine hasn't changed. Scripture hasn't changed in terms of same-sex relationships or same-sex attraction. It points to it in Romans 1 as evidence of a rejection of the truth. And then, of course, when you're molested as a kid and you grow up to be LGBTQIA, that's a consequence of the rejection of the truth of your abuser. I don't make the rules. I just say what they are from the scriptures. And same-sex relationships, same-sex attraction is wrong and indicative of a rejection of God's truth. And so is child sexual abuse. So as I look at the chat, Jacob Johnson, he is imploring others to jump in the chat. He also says that the Freyd's daughter is an actual memory scientist that has won awards and is very respected, while Peter Freyd was just a mathematician, I believe, at the University of Pennsylvania. So if I look at Peter Freyd's daughter, Jennifer Freyd, she's an American psychologist, researcher, author, and educator. She was a psych professor at the University of Oregon in 1990 when she allegedly recovered memories of sexual abuse by her father during childhood. And her parents, Peter and Pamela, denied the accusations and filed the easily debunked False Memory Syndrome Foundation in 1992, which took up the cause of multiple other accused adult abusers of children. And of course, Peter Freyd went on to be exposed as a man who pulled a knife on a graduate student who rejected his sexual advances. Also, Jennifer Freyd's uncle, the brother of Peter Freyd, he backed her. He corroborated her child sexual abuse allegations. And also, Peter and Pamela Freyd were step-siblings who got married, which should provide you some indication of the dysfunction in their family structure and their upbringing. So, there you go. There you go. The clown world that we live in is that all of these politicians and judges that I've pointed out in the church, issues that I've pointed out with barring Jason and Alexia Preston while letting abusers access church property with impunity, even after those abusers have admitted to their bishops and stake presidents that they do fuck kids. All of that is fine in the great state of Utah. So you have the tripartite tomfoolery yet again of the church, the elected officials, and the criminal justice system, all of which appear to collude to let child sexual abusers off the hook with the lowest of penalties, the most lenient penalties imaginable. 112 days for Aiden Hoffman. That was a sentence by John Torgerson for having hundreds of files of child sexual abuse material. And Judge Torgerson's explanation for 112 days being enough is that Aiden Hoffman was a man of privilege. So 112 days is a lot of time for someone as privileged as Aiden Hoffman. And the Utah State Court's defense of Judge Torgerson cited the fact that this was a plea deal worked out by the prosecutors and recommended and backed by adult probation and parole. It's not the justification you think it is. That's actually further evidence of the issue. The fact that a prosecutor would hand this kind of a lenient plea deal to a guy who had over 600 files of child sexual abuse material. That's a fucking problem. And Judge Torgerson wasn't bound by that plea deal. His hands weren't tied. He could have rejected it, but he didn't. 112 days is a lot for a privileged kid. It's a lot. It's very severe. In fact, it's enough. It's probably more than enough for a kid with privilege to serve 112 days in jail for having 600 plus files of child porn. It's a fucking enough. I mean, don't you feel for him? Don't you have empathy? Don't you have empathy for someone who creates the demand for the supply of a product that the manufacturer of which involves raping kids? I mean, it's a lot. 112 days is a lot for a guy who creates demand for that kind of material, which always involves the sexual abuse and degradation of children. It's a fucking lot. I mean, it's not just a picture or video. To produce that picture or video, you have to rape a fucking kid. You have to fuck a kid. But 112 days is a lot for having like 600 plus files of that. For creating the demand for that. For creating the demand for a product that always involves the rape of children, the sexual degradation of children. 112 days, that's a lot for a guy of Aiden Hoffman's privilege. Where do you think Judge John Torgerson got that kind of an attitude? He got it from the church that he's a member of. He got it from the culture that church has provided this state. That's where he got it. It's a culture that immunizes abusers from any external consequence whatsoever. It keeps things in-house. And if victims do go to the police or against the advice of their bishops or stake presidents, they are ostracized by their ward families. They're ostracized by their fellow church members. But the guy who raped their fucking kid or their wife, that guy, he's embraced by his ward family. Deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. Darvell. Church is very proficient in it. And the church is the fucking big problem in this state. Out of the tripartite components, that is the church, the elected officials, and the criminal justice system, the other two feed off of the church. The other two take directions from the church. Like, it's that simple. You think if Todd Wheeler was afraid that his temple recommends was going to be revoked, that he would have come out and said we should shorten the term on the sex offender registry for certain sexual offenses, certain sexual abusers, to just 10 years because it shouldn't be a life sentence? You think he would have said that if he thought his temple recommends were at risk? No. He said it with full confidence that the church wasn't going to come down on him and discipline him for taking that position. J. Stewart Adams, Jabez, the Senate president, you think if he thought there would be consequences from the church for lessening the punishment for 18-year-olds who fuck 13-year-olds, that he would have done that? You think he would have done that if he thought the church was going to, like, come down on him and discipline him? No. He wouldn't have. But he knew the church wasn't going to do shit. The church never is going to do shit in terms of increasing the severity for sexual offenders. People who rape and fuck kids. People who fuck other adults without their consent. Against their clear resistance. You think these legislators would act this way if they didn't have the full backing of the church in doing so? or at the very least, the implicit backing of the church, due to the fact that the church doesn't punish people who take these outrageous positions, who say outrageous shit like a guy who fucked an infant in 1994 isn't a threat to the community. That's Judge Catherine Conklin. Or a bishop who raped and sexually assaulted 2 women is an extraordinarily good man. That's Judge Thomas Love. You think any of these people would risk their membership in the church over it? Or their standing in the church over these trashy ass sexual abusers? They'd take up their cause. They'd express sympathy and empathy with them if they thought that their membership in the church was going to be at risk. If they thought that they were going to get one of those church security office letters that Jason Alexia Preston got, which barred them from the premises of any church-owned properties. You think that they do that? No. They know, they have full confidence the church is not going to do shit to them if they take these positions. But everyone who exposes it and who reports on it, you do it at the risk of your membership and your standing in the church. That's the fucking level here. That's the level of what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with this idiocy in real time. And there are a lot of people who want to be in the church and say, well, I know that the church is true, but this does happen. Well, how's it happen in a true church? Where the members are actually following the rules of the club in which they belong, because the club actually enforces those rules. How does this kind of shit happen? How do kids get fucked by a church whose leaders have spiritual discernment and who are truly called of God and who know what's what? How does this happen? It's not a true church. It's a church that covers up sexual abuse and molestation to the benefit of sexual predators while harming and threatening those who expose it. So fuck the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Church of Latter-day Saintness, which is what a lot of the leaders are. If not overtly, then covertly. That's who they serve. When you have a choice between someone who rapes and sexually abuses others and someone who speaks out against it, I always choose the person who speaks out against it, because I have some semblance of moral clarity. And I left the church over this issue because the church isn't going to do shit about it. And that's how you know the church isn't true. The church is going to bludgeon victims in a non-disclosure agreements. They're going to threaten them with protracted civil litigation to compel them to enter into those non-disclosure agreements, because what the church is buying is silence. The church isn't compensating victims for the abuse that they suffered. It's buying their silence. That's the entire model the church follows as an institution with $250 billion in assets. That's the fucking level. Jacob Johnson in the comments, and also trafficking children, which they are directly involved in. Unfortunately, through LDS Social Services and adoption, I've come to that conclusion as well. I actually spoke to somebody the other day, one of several dozen. I'm up to 332 victims now that I've spoken to and interviewed. I did an initial interview with one yesterday that went 80 minutes. Much longer than I prefer an initial interview to go. But she was adopted twice. 2 of her families were Mormon. Thank God the third one was Lutheran and not abusive, like sexually. Thank God she got out of this. But ultimately, the fact that any child is subjected to this at all is an abomination. The state of Utah, 1 out of every 6 high school age students reports being sexually abused. Now, according to the statistics and the data, roughly a third of people report their abuse. So you extrapolate that out to that 1 out of 6, and it's actually close to 48-50% who are actually abused, because 2/3 don't report, even if they're asked privately. So in the state of Utah, a bunch of kids who were raised in the church report they've been subjected to sexual violence either by their peers or by other adults over the course of their life. What do you think that 13 or 14-year-old boy who's sexually assaulting his female classmates in middle school, where do you think he learned that shit from? It begins in the home, good behavior and bad behavior. And so there are priesthood holders in this state, fathers and husbands, who are setting an example for their sons, that those sons manifest in their behavior towards their peers in their schools. Like, that's the fucking reality in this state. Don't think that 13 or 14-year-old boy, just of his own volition and on his own initiative, decided to sexually abuse or assault his female classmate. Don't think that shit happened in a vacuum. He had a father who set examples for him in how to treat women, how to treat girls. Again, I go back to my father. My father was adamant, boys don't hit girls. I had 2 sisters who asked for it left and right. They hit me, but I couldn't raise a finger to them. They constantly antagonized me verbally. Any boy would have been knocked out. But they're girls, so you can't put your hands on them. That's that example and that black and white rule served me well in life. I didn't have domestic violence calls. I didn't put my hands on my wife no matter what she did. You know, I don't hit women. Because of my father set that rule for me early on in my life. My first sister, I was 5 years old. My second sister, I was 6. At the end of the day, don't hit girls, don't hit women, don't hit females. That was drilled into me. I had to talk. I already knew what sex was in 5th grade. The next year, my dad was supposed to take me on a camping trip and have the talk with me. But something came up with work, so my mom wound up having the talk with me, and that was mortifying. Because my mom was crazy. My dad, like a week or 2 later, he said, "You know what your mom talked to you about?" I knew what he was talking about, and I said, "Yes." And I'm just thinking to myself, I'm going to have another mortifying conversation with my dad about it. And he said, "If you do that before marriage, sex, I'll kill you." Now, I'm not saying that was appropriate, but I am saying that I didn't have my first girlfriend, I didn't have sex until I was like in college. So on a certain level, I believe my dad when he said he'd kill me. I believe my dad about the importance of sexual purity. Because there's going to be a consequence for me. I'm not saying it's right that he threatened to kill me over sex outside of wedlock. But I am saying it was effective. I was terrified of that man. And it worked in the sense that I took sex seriously when I did finally engage in it. I stupidly thought that the first person I had sex with was going to be the only person I had sex with. I'm going to, that's the way it is. Like, I looked at my first girlfriend, and that's just because I had sex with her. I'm going to marry her. No, that's not the way the world works. The cart does not come before the horse. And predictably, that decision had repercussions for me later. It had repercussions for my future relationships to the point where, my late 20s, I just didn't consider myself to be marriage material. And to some extent, that traced back to childhood sexual abuse that occurred when I was 6 and continued on until I was like 7.5. I guess I just aged out for my abuser. They moved on to someone or something else. That feeling that you were every awful thing that happened to you, the way it affects your esteem, the way it affects what you look at yourself as qualified for, that's reason enough to deal with sexual abuse severely. No one should have to feel that way. Period. And if any victims are watching, I want to drill this point home to you. You're not at fault for any of your abuse. Your abuser is. Who's responsible for rape? The rapist, not the victim. Not. I don't care what you were wearing. I don't care, that you picked that person for a date or that you were alone with that person and maybe that's considered unwise. Like if they raped you, you said no to sex and they continued, they're at fault. It's that simple. And it doesn't matter if you're dealing with tomfoolery, such as Utah, with these cultural norms that contextualize rape and, to some extent, call it something other than what it is, which is rape. They try to sit there and say that you were asking for it, or they try to sit there and say it's your fault because of the context. You enticed or beguiled your rapist. Those terms come up time and time again. You beguiled your rapist. You did not beguile your rapist. Your rapist is a piece of shit who, when you said no to sex, or when you were legally and morally incapable of consenting to sex because you were a fucking child, that guy is responsible for raping you. He's the only person who bears responsibility. Any adult, male or female, who fucks a kid is responsible for fucking a kid. Kid's not responsible. That 13-year-old boy who Abigail Marie Ross, the step-granddaughter of Utah Senate President Stuart Adams Jabez, that 13-year-old boy is not responsible for what Abigail Marie Ross did as an adult. Abigail Marie Ross was a legal adult, and she was culpable under the law, 25 years to life. But because her grandfather was a Utah Senate president, she got a lesser sentence, even though the law that he induced his friends in the Utah Senate to pass, allowing an 18-year-old who is still in high school to receive a lesser sentence, even though that law wasn't retroactive to Abigail Marie Ross, that's in effect what happened. She got a lesser sentence because that law was passed. And it was only passed because her step-grandpappy, Jabez Stewart Adams, was Utah Senate president. So she got a lesser sentence for fucking a 13-year-old boy. And if the roles were reversed and Abigail Marie Ross was the 13-year-old and some 18-year-old boy stuck his dick in her, Jabez Stewart Adams, he wouldn't have advocated for a lesser sentence for that 18-year-old boy. because that 18-year-old boy's still in high school. He would have wanted him to burn in hell. That's the standard here in Utah. It is a double standard for the politically connected, and for those who are connected to the church's elite, the church's aristocracy. I mean, it's very clear in the Epistle of James. You're not supposed to show partiality to anyone. God doesn't show partiality, but in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, partiality is the rule of the day. And those who toe the line go up the ladder. Those who keep their mouths shut about the endemic level of sexual abuse in this church, they move forward. Those who play the game, cover up sexual abuse, they move up the ladder. They get higher and higher church callings, and their families benefit. The church has $250 billion in assets that we know of. What do you think it does with those fucking assets? It retains Kurt McConkie, and it pays millions upon millions of dollars in legal fees to suppress the exposure of the full extent of sexual abuse within its ranks, and sexual impropriety and financial corruption. It pays law firms millions, if not billions of dollars to cover up its corruption. And those law firms intimidate and bully victims of that corruption. It has 13 shell companies which it hid assets in from the SEC, and it was fined for doing so. This is a church that broke the law in terms of the disclosure of its financial dealings, and it was trying to conceal those assets from its own membership. Because if the membership realized the church was sitting on $250 billion in assets, they might question, why are we paying tithes? The reason you're paying tithes is evident to everybody. Your church is engaged in priestcraft. It's selling access to the temples. That's the only locations you can do the ordinances that you believe are going to lead you to exaltation, to becoming a god in the celestial kingdom. And you pay your 10% so that you'll have access to those temples to do those ordinances so that you can become a god. We all know why. We all know why. You pay your 10%. And it isn't altruistic. It's not like your fast offering or anything. It's for your own fucking benefit, because you believe that by paying that 10%, you're going to go to the temple, you're going to do those ordinances, and you're going to get to the celestial kingdom, you're going to become a god, and everybody else will be a dickless ministering angel at best, doing your bidding. Buy a ticket to the prayer wheel, everybody. That's what the Mormon Church is selling. It's selling priestcraft. We all know why you stay in the good graces of the church and why you pay that 10%. So that you can go to the temple and become a god someday. It has nothing to do with anything altruistic. It has to do with your own standing in this life and in the next. So, fuck them. They're selling a ticket to heaven, basically. They're selling a ticket to a hierarchy in the afterlife that doesn't truly exist. You're not going to be a god. You're going to be what you are now. Piece of shit. The only difference is your surroundings are going to be hotter. There is a price for covering up sexual abuse and corruption, for looking the other way when people are raping kids. There is a price to be paid for that in eternity. And no amount of paying your 10% or contributing to the church or consecrating your time, talents, and everything else the Lord has blessed you is going to change that. There's a price to be paid. It's fucking millstone season. And the reprobate reasoning that goes into all of the things that I presented here today in the tripartite tomfoolery, that is the church, the elected officials, and the criminal justice system. That price to pay is destination hell. That's where you're going. And you can bully people in this life. You can have your church security office send a letter barring people from your premises who report on this and who expose it, which is what you did to Jason and Lexi at Preston. And I have my differences with the Prestons, which have been publicly known. But what you did to them is unconscionable. They truly do believe in you. No matter what you've covered up or done, they believe that you can be salvaged and redeemed. The reality of it is, you're a piece of shit institution that covers up child sexual abuse that's endemic in your ranks. You protect predators. And you ostracize victims who have the courage to report and tell their own story on their own terms to the police and everybody else. So fuck you. I'm not here to be nice or to mince words about it. You're a piece of shit. And as I said earlier, when given the choice between lining up with an institution that covers up sexual abuse and ostracizes victims who have the audacity to report it or say it out loud, and lining up with the victims of that abuse or the people who are trying to expose it, for me, the choice is clear. I choose the victims, and I choose the people who are actively working to advocate for victims and expose the corruption and the abuse. And for those of you who choose to line up with an institution that routinely covers up child sexual abuse and bullies victims, I think I got one word to say, and that's fuck. I got two words to say. Fuck you. Like, the gloves are off. This is millstone season. It's that simple. If the church doesn't want to reform its ways as an institution, it's got to go. It's 501c3 status. Should have been stripped a long time ago. Ultimately, in the late 19th century, the correct solution was being implemented. The church was stripped of its corporate status and its charter, and its assets were being confiscated because it was a lawless criminal enterprise. And it was that then, it's that now. It's not polygamy or plural marriage so much. It is the covering up and the concealment of sexual abuse and financial corruption. It's breaking the law with regards to being transparent about its assets and its wealth. And it's also arguably breaking the law when it comes to obstructing justice and the full accounting and exposure of the sexual abuse that its members commit. That's the reality. Unfortunately, I could go on for hours about this. What I would say in closing is that those of you who have a problem with my language or my profanity on this podcast, but you have less of an issue with the things that I'm condemning, you're the fucking problem. You are absolutely the problem. And telling victims to shut up or tell their stories a certain way robs them of their agency, even more so than the people who exploited them sexually and overrode their consent robbed them of their agency. You're compounding the issue. Victims should be able to tell their stories on their terms to whoever they like, police or otherwise. Because at the end of the day, their abuser shouldn't be in charge of the narrative. And their abusers include an institution that suppresses the exposure of the abuse. Their abusers include members of that institution who tell them, "Oh, you shouldn't talk about it all the time. You shouldn't talk about these things." Why? Because it makes you uncomfortable? The truth hurts. It hurts to know that you were in a pew next to sexual predators and you didn't have any insight into that. You didn't have any awareness of what was going on, because this discernment, this small, still voice that supposedly speaks to you, was fucking silent, and that's an indication that your church is bullshit, and your discernment is bullshit, and everything about your priesthood power is bullshit. Reality of it is, moral clarity is pretty easy. If you're obeying God, you know the difference between right and wrong, and you apply it in your own life ruthlessly. And when you see somebody else who isn't doing the same, you know exactly who they're lining up for, and it's the other team. People who allow hypocrisy into their lives, you know exactly who they are. And you don't have to condemn them. You don't have to do anything overt. You don't have to point the finger at them. You know who they are, and you cut them out of your lives because you don't want anything to do with that. Like, fuck them. Fuck the people who tell you that talking about the truth is impolite. This shit is happening. It's happening in every church. It's happening in every community. And it's unacceptable. And you would know that if you had any connection to God whatsoever. You would know the difference between right and wrong. If your life reflected your profession, you had a line to God that could only come through obedience in your life, ruthless obedience, in how you treat your wife, how you treat your kids, how you conduct your business, how you live, you would absolutely know. You would absolutely have discernment as to those who are part of this, either directly or indirectly through covering it up. And I don't bear any witness with anybody, individually or as an institution, collectively, who covers up sexual abuse and sexual exploitation. And the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints does that, and that's how I know it's bullshit. That's how I know its leadership is utter horseshit. It's that simple. So I don't want to hear anything else. I don't want to hear anything about the church being true. One of the most nauseating features is talking with a Mormon who supposedly wants to help with this, but who doesn't want to step outside of the church. He doesn't want to acknowledge the church's role and complicity in this kind of abuse. Doesn't want to acknowledge leadership's involved in this, either covering it up or directly participating or associating with those who commit this type of abuse, like Gordon Bowen. They don't want to do that. They don't want to recognize the fact that the church is the problem. They want to believe the church can be salvaged and redeemed. Well, the church lost its way a long fucking time ago. And that is evident in everything that it does. Especially with respect to covering up child sexual abuse and just sexual exploitation in general. We have a law of chastity in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and in Christianity in general. And it says flat out that sex is for marriage between a man and a woman. That's the only design God has for sex, between a man and a woman united in marriage. In a marriage, a real marriage, there are three components: a biological male, a biological female, and God. And the reason most marriages don't work is because that third component is absent. If you enter into an actual, genuine marriage, you and your wife are committed to God and realizing His plan in your lives and in your family, and you sublimate yourself to God, and you also sublimate yourself to raising children up in the way that they should go. And if you're looking at porn, and if you're having affairs, and if you're sexually abusing other people, guess what? That's an indication that you don't have any real relationship with God. So you can profess Him all day, brother, but if you don't practice Him, you're full of shit as an individual or an institution. And the problem with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Utah is that it doesn't enforce its own rules for its members. If you sexually abuse anybody, you commit adultery, you should be excommunicated. And by the way, looking at pornography is adultery. It takes time away from your wife. It takes sexuality away from your wife. Your body is hers. Her body is yours. And if you're looking at pornography as opposed to spending that time with your wife or your kids, you are cheating on your wife, you're cheating on your family, and you're a piece of shit. And you got to go. It's black and white. It's really simple. It's not complicated. It's not hard to understand. It's very, very simple. And the church who tells you that it's a complicated issue or it's a complex issue, the individuals who tell you that, they're telling you that because they themselves are part of this. They're making an exception for themselves. I interviewed a woman who was married to a man whose job it was in the 80s and 90s to go out and buy the most hardcore pornography and cut it together in a reel that was shown to the brethren, that is the Quorum of the 12, so that they could counsel bishops and stake presidents in how to deal with members who are experiencing a pornography addiction. So they would sit and watch this reel of porn scenes that this guy assembled. They were using church money to pay him to do this shit. To go out and buy porn and cut it into reels so that they could be abreast of the latest in hardcore pornography, so that they could counsel their members on how to overcome pornography. Like, this is the biggest crock of shit. Nobody should be watching this or spending church funds on it. But they were. They were absolutely doing that. You don't need to look at porn to know that it's bad. You know what sexuality is designed to do from God's perspective. It's spelled out in Scripture. You're to be married to your wife. She's to be married to you. The two of you are supposed to be committed to God and providing a godly home environment for your children. And sexuality, sex, is a way of reducing temptation. It's also a way of bonding the two of you intimately so that you're not tempted outside of wedlock. You're not tempted outside of your family. It binds you together. It's also just enjoyable. A few things in life better than an orgasm. My wife's cooking's pretty good, but it's not an orgasm. At the end of the day, we all know what the rules are. We all know what God's design is. And we either choose to obey it and live it, or we choose to reject it. We know what the truth is. The truth is self-evident in God's creation. So these people who want to engage in abstractions time and time again, they want to sit there and say, well, what about these people who never received the knowledge of Jesus Christ, never heard the gospel? What about them? What about them? Romans 1 says, you know God from his creation. You know who God is. You're going to worship him. Creation points to a creator. It's self-evident. So, at the end of the day, we all know. All the abstraction, all the hypotheticals, everything else, it's bullshit. Moral clarity is not hard with respect to this. It's not hard to know that sexual abuse is wrong. It's not hard to know that sexual abusers are predators who have no place in any church that professes Christ. They don't belong. It's not hard to know that pedophiles don't rehabilitate, that rapists don't recover, and that they should go to prison at the least for the rest of their lives. and be executed at the most. Give them due process, but once they're found guilty and once their appeal is denied, take them straight to death row and kill them. It's that simple. We don't have to be sadistic about it. A bullet to the back of the head will suffice. Capital punishment. And that includes child pornography, because if you possess it, you're creating a demand for the abuse of children. You are an accessory after the fact. So fuck you. It is not hard to have moral clarity on these issues. It's not hard to understand the difference between right and wrong. There's nothing complex here. Like, it is ultimately a problem. There's a serious allegation in the comments from Jacob Johnson, Rise to Liberty. I have been told privately that the church funnels money to OnlyFans. I haven't been able to confirm that, but I would be surprised if it wasn't true. I deal in absolutes, what I've directly confirmed, but again, as he said, I wouldn't be surprised based on a lot of the interviews that I've had with victims and witnesses over the past. It's like I'm up to 332 victims in just Hamlin-related matters. Probably between victims and witnesses done at least double that. But the victims are what I keep a running tally of. And I'm up to 332, and if I was just at one, it would be too many. Like, at the end of the day, this is not hard. It shouldn't be hard for a church that claims to be the true church of God on earth to understand what's going on here and deal with it. But apparently it is. And so in the Tripartite Tomfoolery of Utah and the United States, we have all these moral gray areas. And the culture reflects it. The legal reality reflects it. If you want it to change, you're not going to do it through the church. Church is the reason things are the way they are in this state. The reason the politicians and the members of the criminal justice system behave the way that they behave is with the implicit endorsement of the church, which all of these things have been a disaster for ordinary people in the state of Utah, from their standard of living to their cost of living to the fact that their kids, 1 out of every 6 high school age students in the state of Utah, discloses being a victim of sexual violence and abuse. These are people who are under 18. It's 1 out of every 6 kids. You want to act like that's not a problem, especially when only 30% of victims disclose. If you extrapolate those numbers, it's closer to 3 out of 6 kids that have been abused in reality. But 1 out of 6 absolutely disclosed. So get the fuck out of here with this shit. Like, it is a systemic problem in this state. I'm glad my house is on the market and I'm leaving, going back down south, where this kind of shit is dealt with and the culture is different and the food is infinitely better. But this state is fucked. The church is fucked. The church isn't even a church anymore. It's a sanctuary for people who sin. They have infinite do-overs in rebaptism, no matter how many people they abuse. They'll always be welcome back. But the victims who report and who go against the church in this respect, they'll never be allowed back in, because they went against the church and they reported their abuse to the authorities. Instead of trusting the church's process, which always suppresses the abuse, always conceals it, and always provides the predator a path back to full membership and full repentance. With the victim, not so much. I'll be back on later this weekend to continue my efforts in this area. And we'll possibly do a follow-up episode of this weekend. I'm running out of time. I got to be somewhere about 15 minutes. But I appreciate everybody who watched. And I will see you later this weekend. We'll also possibly be doing an anti-tribe episode as well on some of the late breaking news with respect to developments in the United States and abroad that pertain to anti-tribes core mission, which is to discourage tribalism and promote Christ. This is Goel of Investigations in Ritual Abuse.